The millionaire mocked his contract wife, but she became the woman who saved his empire. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our new cinematic stories. It is quick, free, and helps us continue bringing you more beautiful tales of healing, forgiveness, and love. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Thank you so much for your support. Now let us return to our main character. The chandelier light fell like liquid gold across the ballroom as Alexander Ward signed the last page of a deal he did not believe in a marriage contract. Reputation had become his currency, and after a very public scandal, he needed stability more than affection. His empire, Ward Capital, was solid on paper but shaking behind the scenes. Investors had begun to whisper. Competitors were circling like sharks. In his world, emotion was a liability, and love was something only poets could afford. Across the gala floor stood Rachel Evans, poised, graceful, and almost painfully out of place among the city's elite. She wore a simple ivory dress that caught the light softly, like moonlight on porcelain. She was not an heiress, not a celebrity, not someone who belonged in a ballroom filled with diamonds and ambition, yet somehow, every camera found her face. Alexander crossed the room with the kind of confidence that was learned, not born. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes measured everything. He held out a velvet box, not with a ring, but with a pen. 1 year, he said quietly, his tone even and deliberate. We keep each other's lives simple and our reputations intact. Rachel looked at him not with awe, but with understanding. And in return, you will fund my community design initiative, she said softly, no strings attached. And he nodded once. Around them, the orchestra swelled, and the cameras flashed like lightning. Two strangers shook hands under 1,000 chandeliers, sealing a deal that would soon be mistaken for destiny. But beneath her calm exterior, Rachel Evans carried a secret that even she could barely hold. Years ago, her father's company had collapsed under mysterious circumstances, an acquisition that destroyed everything they had built. Alexander Ward's firm had been one of the major beneficiaries of that fall. And though she did not know if he was directly responsible, she had made herself a promise to find the truth, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. As Alexander turned to pose for the press, Rachel glanced at the contract she had just signed. Her fingers trembled only once before she composed herself. To the crowd, it looked like shyness. To her, it felt like the weight of an unspoken vow. When the champagne glasses clinked and the music reached its final note, Alexander leaned closer, his smile sharp but empty. Do not worry, he murmured near her ear. This will be painless if we both remember it is business. Rachel smiled faintly, her voice steady. Business has a way of turning personal when hearts are involved, Mr. Ward. He looked at her for a brief second, as if trying to read something he could not quantify. Then he turned away, dismissing the strange flicker of unease in his chest. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. The city glowed beneath the moonlight, unaware that two people had just signed a contract that would test not only their pride but also the limits of forgiveness. Rachel stood by the car that would take her to the penthouse, her reflection mirrored in the black window. She whispered softly to herself, 1 year, one truth, no matter what it costs. And as the chauffeur closed the door, the music from the ballroom faded into the distance, leaving behind the quiet sound of fate beginning to turn. The wedding that followed was quiet by design. There were no floral arches, no church bells, no laughter echoing through marble halls. Only the skyline of New York glimmered behind them as a minister read the vows that had been stripped of emotion and rewritten as logistics. Rachel Evans stood in her ivory gown on the terrace of Alexander Ward's penthouse. The air was cold, yet she held herself with the calm grace of someone who had learned to endure. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander leaned forward, brushed a formal kiss against her cheek, and whispered, "That should satisfy the photographers." The sound of a single camera click was the only applause. Their marriage began as a schedule. Alexander worked 16-hour days, and Rachel built her new life around his absences. She learned where he preferred his files, how he liked his coffee, and which nights he slept at the office instead of home. The penthouse was vast, but silence filled it faster than air. Still, Rachel treated the space with quiet dignity. She replaced the sterile vases with wildflowers from the market, filled the kitchen with the scent of tea and fresh bread, and turned the balcony into a garden of green. She did not demand affection or gratitude. Her presence was a kind of warmth that expected nothing in return. But Alexander Ward was not a man who noticed warmth. His world revolved around profit margins and quarterly projections. He read reports more often than people. Yet sometimes, when he came home at midnight and found the lights dimmed and a plate waiting on the table, something unfamiliar stirred inside him. Rachel's routine seemed ordinary, but small details betrayed the truth behind her composure. She read French newspapers over breakfast. Her handwriting carried the elegance of someone privately educated. And once, when Alexander's business partner offered her a glass of Bordeaux, she held it with the ease of a sommelier. He began to notice her contradictions, the way she could navigate a charity dinner as effortlessly as a boardroom, the confidence in her silence, the restraint in her eyes. It did not fit the story she had told about being a small-town designer working on local community projects. Yet he pushed the thought aside. Her life was hers. Their contract was clear. In public, they became a perfect portrait of composure. At events, Alexander would rest his hand lightly on her back, and Rachel would tilt her head just enough for the cameras to capture a believable angle of affection. They did not need to speak to understand the performance. Every look, every gesture, every smile was part of the script. Behind closed doors, however, their words were measured. They shared updates, not feelings. When Rachel thanked him for funding her design initiative, he responded with a simple, "You earned it." When Alexander praised her composure during a dinner with investors, she only replied, "It is easier to play a part when you know the ending." But late one evening, as she sat by the window overlooking the city, Rachel found herself studying the reflection of the man she had married. His outline was sharp, distant, and deliberate, the image of a man who had built walls so tall that even success could not climb them. She wondered how much of his pride was armor and how much was pain. Across the penthouse, Alexander watched her from the hallway. The moonlight fell across her face, and for the first time, he noticed something that was not visible in the photographs, a quiet sadness, the kind that cannot be staged. Neither spoke. Yet in that silence, the first crack formed not in their agreement, but in the distance that both had once considered safe. Rachel turned from the window, unaware that Alexander was still watching her. "Good night, Mr. Ward," she said softly. He hesitated, then replied, "Good night, Mrs. Ward." And though it was the same exchange they had spoken a dozen times before, this time it felt different, like a question neither dared to ask. The days after their quiet wedding fell into a rhythm that felt more like a business merger than a marriage. Alexander Ward spent most nights at Ward Capital, surrounded by screens filled with numbers that dictated the future of his empire. Rachel Evans adjusted to the silence that came with being Mrs. Ward, a title that opened doors but locked her heart behind them. It was on one of those cold November mornings that the first spark of something real appeared. A partner fund tied to Ward Capital collapsed unexpectedly. Stock prices trembled. The media began circling, hungry for another fall from grace. Alexander did not sleep for 2 days. He shut himself inside his glass office, running reports, making calls, chasing stability like oxygen. When Rachel appeared at dawn, the staff went silent. She walked into his office, carrying a tray breakfast, a fresh shirt, and a new schedule she had rewritten to clear his next 12 hours. "You cannot stop an earthquake," she said quietly, buttoning the clean collar of his shirt, "but you can tell people where to stand." Her voice was calm, practical, and utterly disarming. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. It was the first advice he had heard in days that did not demand or flatter. "Thank you," he said finally, surprised by how much he meant it. That night, he found her sitting in the library surrounded by blueprints and pencil sketches. "Working late?" he asked. Rachel looked up, startled but smiling. "It is a design for a community center," she explained. "A place for families displaced by your last redevelopment project. It is nothing your board would approve, too expensive, no profit margin." Alexander sat across from her, resting his elbows on the table. "Build it anyway." She blinked. "You would fund something that will not make money?" He smiled faintly. "I have spent years building things that look successful. Maybe it is time to build something that feels right." For a moment, the air softened between them. The world of contracts and pride faded into something fragile, a trace of connection neither wanted to name. Rachel looked at him differently that night. as though seeing the man behind the headlines for the first time. Still, old habits die hard. Alexander woke up the next morning pretending that nothing had changed. He told himself that he admired her discipline, not her kindness, that he respected her mind, not her presence. But deep down, he could not ignore the shift. At charity events, his hand rested on her back, not for the cameras, but because it felt natural. During board dinners, he noticed her opinions carried a quiet authority that others began to respect. He even found himself listening when she spoke. But behind that calm surface, Rachel felt something she did not expect: guilt. Every kindness he showed, every trace of warmth, reminded her of the truth she still carried. The Evans family name had once been synonymous with integrity. Now, buried under old acquisitions and mergers, it lived only in her. She had married Alexander Ward for reasons that were never romantic. She needed access, records, and answers, a way to uncover who had orchestrated the collapse that had destroyed her father's company. And the man sitting across from her, the one now softening in tone and manner, might hold the very key she sought. Late that night, Rachel stared at the folder hidden in her desk drawer, the one marked Evans Group, 2013. She whispered to herself, "Not yet." Then she closed it gently, the sound of the latch barely audible. In another room, Alexander looked out over the city. For the first time, he found himself wondering what kind of woman had agreed to marry him without love, and why he was beginning to wish that she had. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a kind of chill that settled deeper than the weather. Ward Capital was recovering from the market scare, but something in the air between Alexander Ward and Rachel Evans had begun to shift. They moved like two people, sharing the same house but walking through different storms. Alexander grew quieter, working later than ever. Rachel stopped waiting for him to come home. The polite rhythm that had once kept them safe was now cracking under the weight of things left unsaid. It happened one afternoon in the executive tower. Rachel had come to deliver a new design proposal to Alexander's office. When she stepped off the elevator, she overheard two junior analysts whispering in the hallway. "Did you know Ward Capital once bought out the Evans Group?" one said. "It was that messy acquisition years ago. The owner died right after. Tragic story, but a brilliant deal." Rachel froze. The air left her lungs. Her name, her family's name, echoed through the hall like a ghost refusing to die. She turned slowly, her composure unbroken, and kept walking. That evening, alone in the penthouse, she unlocked a small chest she had hidden in the guest room closet. Inside were the pieces of a past she had tried to keep buried: an old lapel pin engraved with the Evans family crest, a photograph of her father standing in front of the company headquarters, smiling on what would be the last day of his career. She sat on the floor, tracing the edges of the photo with her fingers. Her father had been a man of vision and trust, someone who believed that integrity could survive in the corporate world. He was wrong. Someone had leaked false data, the stock had crashed, and within months, everything they owned was gone. He died of a heart attack before the investigation was complete. Rachel had spent years searching for answers. Every path led back to Ward Capital. Every lead vanished behind layers of legal protection. And now, she was living under the same roof as the man who may have destroyed her family. The realization did not bring hatred, only a quiet ache that hollowed her from within. For the next few days, she withdrew into herself. Alexander noticed but said nothing. When he asked if something was wrong, she smiled politely and said she was tired. He told himself not to pry. He had learned long ago that questions created complications. But one night, when he came home earlier than usual, he saw her sitting on the balcony, staring at the city lights. She looked distant, her eyes reflecting both the skyline and something older grief disguised as calm. He approached cautiously. "You have been quiet lately," he said. Rachel turned her head slightly. "You have been busy." He studied her profile, the way the wind played with her hair. "That is not an answer." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "And you would not like the real one." Before he could respond, her phone rang. She excused herself and disappeared into the other room. He did not mean to listen, but her voice carried through the glass door. "Yes, I understand," she said. "Tell Mrs. Howard I will visit this weekend. The foundation records should still be in the archive." Foundation, records. The words pricked at him. He stepped back, pretending he had not heard, but something about her tone stayed with him: the precision, the urgency, the control. That night, as Rachel packed an overnight bag, she told him she was visiting an old family friend. It is personal, she said softly. I will be back by Monday. He nodded, saying only, be safe. When she left, the penthouse felt colder than ever. He poured himself a drink, but it did not warm him. Rachel's driver took her to an ivy-walled estate 2 hours north of the city. The gate opened without question. A woman in her 60s waited by the door, Mrs. Howard, the housekeeper who had once worked for her father. She embraced Rachel like a daughter returning home. You should not be here, the woman whispered. If anyone sees you, Rachel shook her head. I need to see the files, the originals from the merger. I have to know if Ward Capital was the one who forced the sale. Or, the older woman sighed but led her to a small office lined with old ledgers and locked cabinets. Rachel's hands trembled as she opened the drawers, her pulse quickening with every page. In one of the folders, she found a signature that did not belong to her father. Someone had approved a transaction 3 days after he died. The ink was fresh, the stamp forged. Her breath caught. He was not the one who sold it, she whispered. The truth had a cruel way of healing and breaking in the same breath. Back in the city, Alexander stood in his office, staring out at the skyline, his reflection overlapping with the night. Something inside him felt off, like a thread had been pulled loose from a fabric he thought was perfect. He could not explain why Rachel's absence bothered him so much, only that the silence she left behind was heavier than he expected. He poured another drink and whispered to no one, Who are you really, Rachel Evans? Outside, the city lights flickered like secrets waiting to be revealed. The morning sun spilled through the glass walls of Ward Capital, catching the silver frames that lined Alexander Ward's desk. Among them sat a magazine open to a glossy page, their wedding spread. The headline read, The Coal Millionaire and His Enigmatic Bride. The photograph showed Alexander looking perfectly composed beside Rachel Evans, who appeared calm and luminous beneath the crystal chandeliers. Damien Holt, one of Alexander's oldest friends and occasional business partner, strolled into the office that afternoon. He was a man who thrived on gossip and risked the kind who never entered a room without stirring something. He glanced at the magazine and let out a low whistle. You married her, he said, smirking. Rachel Evans. I never thought you'd go back to St. Clair. Alexander's eyes lifted sharply. What are you talking about? Damien flipped the magazine toward him. St. Clair University, Geneva. She studied there. History of art. She won the International Honors Grant. Do you not remember her? She used to attend those lectures by Dr. Marin, always sitting near the window, the quiet girl who made everyone else look loud. Alexander's expression hardened. You must be mistaken. My wife studied design in upstate New York. She's a local architect. Damien laughed softly. Small-town architect? No, my friend. Rachel Evans debated the ethics of provenance with trustees twice her age. Everyone admired her back then. Brilliant, unreachable. She walked through St. Clair like she belonged to another century. Alexander stared down at the page again. The image in print did not change, but the way he saw it did. Her eyes steady and composed, not naive, not accidental. Everything he had dismissed as grace now looked like control. When Damien left, the silence in the office was suffocating. Alexander picked up his phone, hesitated, and then dialed a private investigator, the same one he used for mergers and risk checks. Discreet background review, he said evenly. Rachel Evans. I want every record verified. He told himself it was due diligence. He told himself it was about security. He did not admit that it was fear, the fear that he had married a stranger who might know more about him than he did about her. That evening, Rachel returned from a meeting with the foundation that funded her community design project. She found Alexander standing by the window, still wearing his suit, holding the magazine in his hand. Interesting article, he said casually. Rachel glanced at it, then at him. I do not read the gossip columns. Sighed. St. Clair University, he said, watching her face. Is that true? She paused. Yes. Why? He stepped closer. You never mentioned it. You never asked, she replied, her tone quiet but steady. Alexander looked at her as if she were a puzzle missing one vital piece. Were you planning to tell me eventually? Or was that going to stay buried with everything else? Her voice remained calm. My education does not change the terms of our agreement. You wanted a wife for convenience, not conversation. He did not respond. But after she left the room, he poured himself a drink, the burn of whiskey doing nothing to steady his thoughts. The next morning, the report arrived, bound in black and delivered by hand. Alexander read every page in silence. Rachel Elaine Evans, only child of the late Thomas Evans, founder of the Evans Group, inherited a sealed trust upon his death, attended St. Clair University in Geneva. No recorded employment for 3 years following her father's passing. The final page listed the merger date between the Evans Group and Ward Capital. Alexander's name appeared alongside the signatures that had finalized the acquisition, an acquisition that had pushed the Evans family into bankruptcy. The air left his lungs. He stared at the paper until the words blurred. When Rachel returned that evening, she found him waiting in the study, the report on the table. The light from the city skyline cut across his face like a blade. "Rachel," he said quietly, "why did you marry me?" She looked at him, confusion shadowed by fear. "You offered a contract. I agreed. You know why." He held up the folder. "No, I do not think I do anymore." Rachel's heartbeat quickened, but she stood her ground. "If you think I am lying, then ask yourself what you truly know about me." Alexander did not answer. He only watched as she turned away, her posture as steady as ever. But for the first time, his perfect composure cracked. When the door closed behind her, he whispered into the empty room, "Who are you really?" The question echoed back to him, unanswered, and for the first time since his father's death, Alexander Ward felt the cold taste of uncertainty. Rain swept through the city that night, slanting hard against the glass walls of the penthouse. Thunder rolled in the distance as Alexander Ward waited in the darkened living room, the folder from his investigator open on the table before him. Every page told the same story. Rachel Evans, the woman he had married for convenience, had built her life on secrets. Her degree, her family, her inheritance, her name. When she entered, she was startled to see him still awake. Her umbrella dripped by the door, and her hair clung to her face in damp curls. "You are home early," she said carefully. He did not smile. "St. Clair University," he began, his voice low but controlled. "You studied there. With me. You never said a word." Rachel froze, her hand still on the clasp of her purse. "You never asked." He stepped closer, holding the folder up like a verdict. "And your last name Evans, as in Evans Group, the same company that Ward Capital acquired 10 years ago, the same one that collapsed after your father's death. You are that Evans." Her expression faltered, but she did not look away. "I am his daughter." Alexander's eyes burned with disbelief. "So this is revenge," he said sharply. "You married me to ruin me from the inside." Rachel's voice trembled, but her tone held. "If I wanted to ruin you, Alexander, I would have done it long ago." He laughed bitterly. "Then what do you call this?" She took a deep breath, her composure beginning to crack. "I married you because I needed access to records, to truth. My father died believing someone betrayed him. Ward Capital profited from that betrayal. I needed to know if it was you." The words hung between them, heavy as thunder. Alexander looked at her as if the woman before him had been replaced by a stranger. "So you lied to me," he said, each word cut and clean. "You played the perfect wife, the humble designer, the quiet savior, just to get to my company." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "I did not lie about who I am. I lied about why I stayed." Alexander turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to understand that not everything begins as love," she said softly, "but it can still end in truth." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the fury gave way to something raw, hurt, disbelief, fear. "Get out," he said finally, his voice breaking on the last word. "Take your secrets and leave." Rachel stood frozen, her hands shaking. Then she reached for her ring, slipped it off, and placed it gently on the glass table. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, "but I could not keep living in a lie." "Then congratulations," he said coldly. "You succeeded." She turned toward the door. The storm outside had softened into steady rain, the kind that fell without mercy but also without violence. She opened her umbrella and stepped out into the night, the sound of her footsteps fading against the pavement. Alexander sank into the nearest chair, staring at the empty space she had left behind. The folder still lay open, the black and white photograph of her father staring back at him. He remembered that deal vaguely, the one everyone had called a strategic acquisition. He had not been the man in charge at the time. His father had been. But his own name, his own signature, had appeared on the final document. And for the first time, he wondered how many lives had been crushed under the weight of that single line of ink. Hours passed. The rain slowed. The silence of the penthouse deepened until it felt alive. Alexander poured himself a drink, but the glass shook in his hand. Across the city, Rachel sat in a small apartment she had rented years earlier, long before the marriage. She stared at the folder she had brought from the estate, the forged signature, the proof that her father had not sold their company willingly. Her heart ached with both victory and loss. She whispered to herself, "He is not my enemy. He just never asked to see the truth." But the damage was done. Back in the penthouse, Alexander stood by the window, his reflection fractured by the raindrops that still clung to the glass. The woman who had challenged him, steadied him, softened him, was gone. He told himself he did not care. He told himself it was better this way. But when he looked at the empty chair across from him, he realized something far more painful than betrayal. He missed her. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Ward did not know how to win. The rain that carried Rachel Evans away from the penthouse also marked the beginning of Alexander Ward's undoing. By morning, headlines whispered about irregularities inside Ward Capital. A regulatory inquiry froze several partner accounts after an anonymous tip alleged falsified reports and hidden debts. Investors began to pull out quietly, and the empire that had once seemed untouchable started to crack at its edges. Alexander arrived at the office before dawn, the weight of exhaustion pressing on his chest. His assistants avoided eye contact. The board demanded answers he could not yet give. He spent hours reviewing documents, but none of it made sense. Numbers that had once been flawless now told a story of deceit written in invisible ink. By evening, Damian Holt appeared at his door, carrying the kind of smile that never meant comfort. "Rough day, Alex?" he said lightly. "I warned you about trusting too many people. Investors panic fast when they smell weakness. I could help stabilize the company, bridge some of the debt, but my terms—" Alexander cut him off. "Your terms are a leash." Damian shrugged. A leash is still better than drowning. When he left, the silence that followed was heavier than rain. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He thought of Rachel's voice the night she had confessed the truth about her father. "I needed to know who betrayed him." He had assumed she meant vengeance, but now, as he looked at the forged numbers and vanished funds, he began to wonder if she had seen something he had not. He stayed up all night tracing the old Evans Group acquisition. The further he looked, the uglier it became. The file showed patterns of manipulation, altered valuations, hidden subsidiaries, and anonymous press leaks planted years ago. His father's name appeared on every page, but one signature repeated even after his death, that of a deputy named Martin Cross, a man now conveniently employed at Damian's investment firm. Alexander's pulse quickened. The betrayal was not from Rachel. It had been beside him all along. The next morning, he made a decision he had never made before. He left the tower and went to find her. It took hours, but he finally located her at a museum cafe, seated by the window with a folder beside her. She looked up as he approached, surprise flickering across her face before fading into guarded calm. "Alexander," she said quietly. "I found something," he began, setting a flash drive on the table. "Emails, signatures, internal memos. Martin Cross and Damian manipulated both our families. They framed your father's company, and they used my firm to clean their hands. It was never you against me, Rachel. It was both of us against them." Her breath caught, and her fingers brushed the drive. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I cannot undo the past," he said, "but I can stop lying about it." For the first time in months, his voice carried no pride, no armor, just truth. Rachel looked at him, her eyes softening. "You might lose everything," she said. He nodded. "Then let me lose it honestly." They sat there for a long time, two people once bound by paper and now joined by consequence. Later that night, Alexander stood in his office again, staring out at the skyline that no longer felt like victory. Behind him, the television murmured updates about Ward Capital's investigation. He could have called his lawyers, he could have buried the evidence, but he chose not to. Instead, he called the board and scheduled a full audit. He sent the files to the authorities, and for the first time since he inherited his empire, Alexander Ward stood on the side of truth, even if it meant standing alone. Across the city, Rachel watched the same news. When his name appeared on the screen, not as the accused, but as the man exposing his own company's corruption, she felt something shift inside her. The man who had once mocked her father's ideals had finally chosen to live by them. She whispered softly into the quiet room. It was never about revenge. It was about redemption. Outside, the rain began again. lighter this time as if the city itself was washing away what was left of pride and lies. The morning of the hearing arrived under a sky the color of steel. The storm from the night before had not ended. It had only softened into a steady, endless rain that washed the city clean and heavy at once. Inside Ward Tower, the once bustling offices were silent. Half the staff had resigned, and the rest avoided making eye contact. The company was under investigation, its reputation hanging by a thread. Alexander Ward had spent the night preparing his statement for the tribunal, but his mind was not on numbers or contracts. It was on Rachel Evans. Her voice, her steadiness, the moment she had walked away. For the first time in his life, he understood the meaning of loss, not financial, but human. When he finally stepped out into the rain, he did not go to the office. He went to the old Evans townhouse, the one Rachel had once mentioned quietly but never invited him to see. The gate stood open as if waiting. The ivy along the wall trembled under the drizzle, and through the haze, he saw her standing by the steps, her coat soaked through, her hair undone. Rachel turned when she heard his footsteps. "You should not be here," she said softly. "I had to come," Alexander replied, breathless from more than the run. "I was wrong about you, about everything." She studied him, unsure whether to believe him. "You destroyed yourself trying to hold up a world that was already broken," she said. He stepped closer. "And you destroyed your peace, trying to avenge a man who deserved truth, not revenge. We are both guilty." Rachel hesitated, her eyes filled with a quiet ache. "Why tell the truth now, Alexander, when it ruined you?" He met her gaze without flinching, because the lie already did. From his coat, he pulled a folder sealed in plastic to protect it from the rain. "These are the files Damien tried to bury the internal memos, the kickback logs, the emails that prove he used both of us. He blamed your father's death on fabricated reports. My father signed them without knowing what they were. When I inherited Ward Capital, I inherited the crime." Rachel's hands trembled as she took the folder. She flipped through the pages, the ink smudged slightly from the moisture. "You will lose everything," she whispered. "I already lost what mattered," he said quietly. "Now I am just trying to make things right." They stood there beneath the gray sky, the world shrinking to the sound of rain and breath. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, as thunder rolled distantly over the river, Rachel took one small step closer. "You are going to testify tomorrow?" she asked. He nodded. "Every name, every lie. I will not let them hide behind the dead." Her eyes softened. "Then bring these files. I will testify too. We finish this together." Alexander's throat tightened. "Together?" Rachel nodded. "You once taught me that control means power. Now we will learn what truth means." He smiled faintly, his first real smile in months. "Truth is terrifying." She smiled back, tears mixing with the rain. "So is forgiveness." For a moment they stood face to face, soaked and shivering, yet still unmoving. Alexander reached for her hand, not as a demand but as a vow. She did not pull away. Their foreheads touched, quiet and steady beneath the downpour. It was not a kiss of passion, but of release of fragile peace between two people who had finally stopped fighting fate. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we end this clean." He nodded. "And then what?" Rachel looked at him, her eyes glimmering with something that almost looked like hope. "Then we start over, if we still can." As he walked back down the street, the rain eased, and sunlight broke weakly through the clouds. For the first time in years, Alexander Ward did not feel like a man running from his past. He felt like someone walking toward it with open hands and a heart finally ready to change. The tribunal hall was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the rustle of papers. Rachel Evans sat on one side of the polished oak table, her posture calm and deliberate. Across from her sat Alexander Ward, the man who had once hidden behind contracts and pride, now stripped of both. Every word spoken that morning would decide the fate of Ward Capital and perhaps the final chapter of their story. The hearing began. Rachel spoke first. Her testimony was clear, composed, and painfully honest. She explained how her father's company had been manipulated, how documents were forged to force a sale, and how Ward Capital's records had been falsified long before Alexander ever inherited control. Her words were not vengeful. They were measured, precise, and anchored in truth. Then it was Alexander's turn. He stood without notes. His voice was steady but softer than anyone had ever heard it. "For years," he said, "I believed that strength meant control, that admitting fault was weakness. I see now that silence is far more destructive than failure. He paused, glancing toward Rachel before continuing. The people responsible for this corruption are not the ones on the front page. They are the ones who hid behind trust, who used loyalty as a weapon. And I allowed it. I was blind because I wanted to be untouchable. That ends today. The evidence they presented together was undeniable. Emails, transfer records, signatures all traced back to Damian Holt and Martin Cross. Within hours, the tribunal voted unanimously to hold them accountable. Ward Capital's board dissolved, its assets frozen for restructuring. The empire that had defined Alexander Ward was gone, but in its place stood something stronger: integrity. Months passed. The scandal faded into history, replaced by quiet rebuilding. Out of the ashes of Ward Capital rose a new venture, the Evans Ward Foundation, dedicated to ethical redevelopment and urban renewal. It was the project Rachel had once drawn in pencil, the one Alexander had told her to build anyway. Now it was real. On the morning of its launch, the city's skyline glowed with soft spring light. Donors mingled under the terrace canopy. Reporters waited, notebooks in hand. Rachel stood beside a window overlooking the river, wearing a pale ivory coat and a piece she had fought hard to earn. Alexander approached, holding a single page in his hand. No contracts, no clauses, only a handwritten title, Contract of Hearts. Beneath it, one sentence read, "This time, no signatures, only a life." Rachel laughed quietly, tears gathering in her eyes. "That is not legally binding," she said. He smiled. "Good. Neither is forgiveness, and it still works." They stepped together toward the crowd as cameras began to flash, but this time there was no performance. His hand found hers naturally, not as part of an image, but as a truth finally spoken aloud. Somewhere a journalist whispered, "It is a love story," but it was not. It was a story about redemption, a man who learned how to be human, and a woman who discovered that healing could come from honesty, not revenge. As the event ended, the two of them lingered by the balcony overlooking the water. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, and the horizon shimmered in gold. Rachel looked up at him. "Do you ever think about what we lost?" Alexander shook his head. "Only what we found. Empires fall, but grace that lasts." She smiled, leaning gently against him as the city below began to hum with life again. For the first time, there were no contracts to bind them, no pride to protect, no lies left to tell. There was only truth and the quiet miracle of two hearts that had chosen to begin again. And as the sun broke through the clouds, it felt as if even the city itself had forgiven them.